So Armand, I'm not sure if you can see
Uh-huh.
what's happening, but you know, the attendees are coming in.
Oh, I have students among them.
Oh, good.
Nice.
We need all the pinging though as they enter, right? Ding, ding,
It adds to the drama, right? Okay, I'm seeing it round out and slow down. So I'm going to start talking. Most of the first minute or so is addressed to the students who are already panelists anyways. So I just want to welcome everyone to tonight's Faculty Student Scholarship Seminar, KSC 199. If you're a student, remember, and there are a few of you new students out there to the course. If you are new to the course, be sure to get your syllabus at the course Canvas site, read it, and be sure to ask me questions if you have them. You're going to see, if you've read it, that 75% of the grade is based on attendance at the talks, and attendance is going to be checked in random audit of on-camera participants once or twice during the talk tonight and every night. You and the other students and a handful of others are present as webinar participants. You can be seen if the gallery is presented right by the presenter, and you have the opportunity for spoken questions during the talk if the presenter wants, or after the talk is done. We also have an audience of registered attendees. The attendees can't be heard by participants or presenters. They can't be seen. And if you're one of those, please enjoy the presentation. And please ask your questions in the Q&A box so that Lynn Arnold, who is helping to monitor, and I can convey them to the evening's presenter. Tonight's presenter is our second speaker for the semester. She's Dr. Armagan Gezici. Dr. Gezici is professor in and chair of the Department of Economics and Political Science. She holds a BS and an MS from the Middle East Technical University in Ankara, Turkey. She also holds an MA and a PhD in economics from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst down the road. She's been at Keene State since 2007, where she teaches international trade and finance, financial and developmental economics, and she teaches a game theory course, which is extremely popular despite being, as my students tell me, much harder than the title sounds. Her research and publication has been in the area of industrial and production economics, market structure, technological and structural change, and she's had a super productive couple of years, my assessment. And her talk tonight is titled An Intersectional Analysis of COVID-19 Unemployment. It's not just very relevant, it's based on her latest publication in the Journal of Economics, Race and Policy, and I'll let her tell you about it, so please welcome Dr. Gezici. And it would feel better to clap right now, but we are electronic, so imagine clapping.
Thank you so much, Mike. Thanks everyone for coming and joining us tonight. The talk I will give is from a recent research. You can imagine that I started this research project only after April of last year, because we didn't know about COVID before that, pretty much. I'll be talking about unemployment caused by this pandemic, and I'll basically present some empirical results of the work, looking into different groups and how their experiences varied, and that's what this image here is supposed to be about. But before I move on, between the time I signed up for the seminar and now, the research that the article was presented in got published in Journal of Economics, Race and Policy. It was their special issue on the economic impacts of unemployment, COVID-related impacts of the pandemic, unemployment impact of the pandemic. So I should mention that the research was conducted with a colleague of mine, another economics professor from Fitchburg State College, Özge Özay, as the secondary author. You'll see her name here. Okay, before I tell you about how this talk is going to work out, I should probably mention very briefly what I mean by intersectionality, because as you can see, the title says an intersectional analysis, which kind of is mysterious to some of us at least. I learned about this term only a couple of years ago, so I should mention that. And it's simply a way of describing how race, class, gender, and other individual characteristics intersect with one another and overlap to compound or differentiate people's experiences. So the term was coined by a legal scholar and a Black feminist, Kimberly Crenshaw, in 1989. And since then, especially in humanities and social sciences, outside of economics in particular, have been widely used to better understand the differences in experiences. So when I say intersectional analysis, I'm basically using it as a lens to understand the differences in labor market experiences of white men, white women, black men, black women, Hispanic men, Hispanic women. So intersection of race and gender categories is what I have in this analysis. And the reason for doing so will be quite obvious as we go through the talk, of course, but you can even come from your own experiences. You know, men and women might have different experiences, and we can see the commonalities across women's experiences, but it would be hard to imagine a white woman and black woman would have the very same experiences when it comes to issues like finding jobs or choosing fields of education and so on and so forth. Anyhow, those details will be more clear as I go through. So what I want to do briefly to tell you what I will do in this talk. So I'll just show you why we decided to study this particular topic, talking about unemployment in general during the pandemic since March 2020. And then I'll introduce some of the economic theories explaining why there would be differences between groups of gender or race in labor market. For those who are not familiar with the term, labor market here is encompassing all our experiences in finding jobs, getting employed, being fired, and wages we get paid, and industries we work in and occupations we have. All those are different dimensions of understanding experiences in labor market. And then I'll talk briefly about characteristics of COVID-19 related recession to better understand how it differs from previous recessions that our country has gone through. And then I'll introduce the data sources and a quantitative analysis I'm presenting the results from, and briefly talk about what the types of variables I'm using, and we'll come to the discussion and results section at the end. So the motivation for this is not really that mysterious, honestly. Motivation was the skyrocketing unemployment that occurred in March and April of 2020. So what I have here is derived from Bureau of Labor Statistics monthly unemployment data, starting in 1948 till the end of last year, December 2020, just to give you a sense of what unemployment rate we reached during the pandemic in April 2020. It was around 15%, and how that rate compares to the unemployment rate of the previous decades. You might not remember, of course, but 2008, 2009 was the most recent, as we call it, Great Recession for the US economy, which for some people was comparable to the experience of contraction for the economy during the Great Depression of 1930s. And you see here how that unemployment rate of Great Recession was actually barely above 10%, while in April 2020, unemployment rate reached 15%. And The highlighted, the shaded areas, as you can see here in gray, are the recessionary periods for the US economy. I wanted to show you that because you can see that unemployment rate peaks during the recessions. And that's understandable. That's we understand as a recession that job losses occur, businesses shut down because there is an economic contraction. The economy slows down, and typically a crisis occurs around the tip of that point. So technically, with the contraction that began in April, US economy entered the recession. There's actually a technical definition where recession refers to the 2 quarters within a year where economic growth is not positive, but negative. So the economy in real terms shrinks. So these shaded regions, shaded areas indicate those periods over the US history. Okay, so while 15% is obviously unprecedented and incredibly high unemployment rate, I should also add, for instance, that it probably is underestimating, the actual unemployment rate. So here's a quote, not a quote, but what the Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell said on February 10, 2021, which is not even a month ago, that the real unemployment rate today is closer to 10% perhaps, rather than, you'll see here in detail, I'll show you, the 6 or 7% that official unemployment statistics are telling us. Coming from the chairman of the Federal Reserve, this is a quite powerful statement telling us that official statistics currently are not really capturing the degree of seriousness of the problem we are having here. So that's, the motivation, the beginning point in a sense. It was terrible for a lot of people because so many people lost their jobs. But after that, we started reading around mid-May perhaps that women were actually in a worse condition when it came to keeping their jobs compared to men. So I'll show you, I'll take you to a website here. I hope it opens. Comparing the unemployment rate of men and women, again, over the same period of time. I wanted to use this website's charts because of the interactive nature of it. You can actually look at the whole history starting from 1948, which is the year, starting year for the official statistics. Or you can also look at it in a much more over a limited time period. So one thing I want us to understand, first of all, is that up until 1980s, no matter where the economy was during its cycle, whether it was actually expanding or slowing down or having a recession, women's unemployment rate was pretty much throughout the whole post-World War II period was above men's unemployment rate. Things change around 1980s. And then what we see after 1980s is that, perhaps this way, that men's unemployment exceeded women's unemployment during the recessionary periods mostly. So when we look at the 2008-2009 Great Recession, as we call it, we understand in this chart why that period was called men's session rather than recession by some journalists in particular. So at the peak of that recessionary period, you see that men's unemployment rate reached a point like 11%, while women's unemployment rate was 8.4%.
Armand?
Yeah?
I'm sorry to jump in.
Oh, I'm sorry, you're not seeing it.
That's right.
Oh.
We see the link, but I bet the
I'm
screen.
sorry.
There it is. Okay, thank you.
I'm really sorry about that. So let me just quickly show you what I was talking about before. The orange line here shows women's unemployment rate, which was always above men's rate over the post-World War II period, up until 1980s, where things changed. And we can talk about the reasons behind it too, but that's not my focus here. After 1980s, you see that these rates are really close to each other, except the recessionary periods, like early 1990s. 92 was another recessionary period for the US economy. Men's unemployment rate reached higher levels than women. Another one, 2001, 2002, and 3, another recession. Men's unemployment rate got higher than women's. And finally, perhaps the most drastic one was the 2009 recession, Great Recession, where men's unemployment reached 11%, while women's unemployment was 8.5%. Now, this is also considered to be typical during recessions up to this point. So I'm just limiting the time period to last 5 years only. So then, or perhaps 10 years, you see that both men and women's unemployment rates decline, indicating an expansion in economic activity. Jobs were created almost proportionally for both men and women. And then we were hit by the pandemic and people were laid off. And recession began in the US economy. But this time, women's unemployment rate reached much higher levels than men's unemployment rate. So that was one big difference that this recession caused by the pandemic brought to the US economy. Now, can you see my slide again?
Yes.
Okay, so that's a part of why we wanted to understand this difference during the recession. The other dimension of this, of course, is how that changed for different racial categories. I'm back at the website. I'm hoping that you can see that too.
Yes, we can.
Okay. So what we have here is 3 groups of people in the labor market, 3 racial categories of Black or African American, and I'll be using these terms interchangeably, Hispanic or Latino, and whites, and their unemployment rates over time. What we are seeing is the fluctuation in each of these series, while there's something quite persistent, that the highest unemployment is for Blacks and the lowest unemployment is for whites, which is more or less what we know already. One thing is interesting, when unemployment rate increases, as it happened in 2009 and previous recessions, that gap between the unemployment of different racial groups narrows down almost, like as it happened around this time here. While earlier in the previous decades, the gap was much wider. So that was another reason, since these rates are under normal circumstances quite different from each other, trying to understand how those differences persisted over the recessionary time period was another reason why we undertook this study. And I just want us to see the details. Again, slightly different pattern we see for this particular recession induced by the pandemic, that Black unemployment rate reached high levels, but only to be exceeded by the unemployment rate for Hispanics, which was unusual. Again, it never happened before during the previous recessionary period. Although the initial jump in all of that, all those 3 categories, is quite obvious. Recovery also was quite different. That initial big jump, big hike in Hispanic unemployment rate really changed and dropped faster compared to the unemployment of African Americans. Okay, so differences are obvious. Women's unemployment increased more than men's this time during this recession. And unemployment for people of Hispanic origin increased more than that of whites or Blacks. Then the questions are, how can we explain these differences? And What about intersectional categories? When we talk about women's experience being worse, does it apply to all three racial and ethnic categories and women in those categories, or is it particular to only Black women or only Hispanic women? So that's what this study is trying to understand. Of course, you can imagine why people would be unemployed, and you might have your own insights into that, or we can think that it really depends on the kind of industry you are employed in, depends on the type of occupation you have, what kind of harm has been done, if it is about the crisis or recession to those activities. In general, in economic theory, there are two main strains of literature trying to understand these differences, not only for unemployment, but in labor market. Why is there a wage gap between men and women? Or firing and hiring practices, why are they so different across racial categories? So all those agree on one thing, although the reasoning underlying causes pointed at are different. They agree that gender and race groups are overrepresented in certain industries or certain occupations. Whenever these industries and occupations are impacted by recessions, those groups that are overrepresented will be disproportionately impacted, and they might be losing their jobs, or they might see the cuts in their wages. And particularly about recessionary impacts, the focus has been on industry and occupation distribution of these groups. Now, of course, I use the term here, overrepresented. What does that mean? Now, it doesn't mean more than 50% of people would be in a particular group. It means compared to the share of the groups of people in workforce of the country. For instance, women, it changes from year to year, but approximately make up 50% of the US workforce. Hispanics make up 18% and Blacks make up 12%. Now, overrepresentation for any of these groups of people would mean that in an industry or an occupation, the proportional share of workers that are Black will be higher than 12%. Proportional share of workers that are Hispanic of origin, will be higher than 18%. Same thing for women versus men kind of distinction. So is there really evidence of that? That's quite obvious, actually. There is really strong evidence that overrepresentation is a thing in lots of different industries and occupations. For instance, women are overrepresented in a lot of frontline industries. Frontline industry is a term that we've used and heard a lot during this current pandemic-related recession. Like healthcare is considered one of them. So women make up 77% of workers in healthcare industry, 85% in childcare and social services. When it comes to different occupations, not industries, but the type of jobs they're in, 71% of cashiers in the US are women. 64% of salespersons, pharmacy technicians, almost 82%. Fast food workers, 67% are women. So these are only examples of industries and occupations that women are overrepresented in. A similar thing exists for racial and ethnic categories too. For instance, Blacks are overrepresented in ground transportation. Although they only make up 12% of the workforce, 31% of workers in the ground transportation activities are Black. Postal services, 27%. Nursing, residential care, warehousing, storage. These are all overrepresented industries for Blacks. And briefly, Hispanics, we see similar pattern in construction, in textile manufacturing, in accommodation, basically in hotels, agriculture. Hispanics, people of Hispanic origin are overrepresented. So different theories exist, but most of those theories, with their explanations, boil down to this fact that groups are not evenly distributed across all types of jobs and industries. But before moving on, I want to talk a little bit about theories, because those theories inform the kind of variables that I will be choosing in trying to explain why some people are unemployed while the others are not. So how does this overrepresentation occur, for instance? So these theories are also helpful in explaining that. Two main lines of work in the literature exist. One of them focuses more on individual specific factors. The other one, the set of theories, not a single theory, focuses more on social factors, if you like. So individual preferences, for instance, these are mostly concerning gender differences. Some theories early on, starting in 1970s and 80s, suggested that women prefer to work in certain industries. They don't want to work in other industries. They prefer being teachers and nurses. They don't want to become physicians. You can see that, it's really a limited theory, but it is a theory in the sense that it really doesn't explain why women would prefer, even if those preferences exist for women. Another theory introduced by one of the Nobel Prize winners in economics, Becker, emphasizes how pretty much stemming from biological differences, men and women have different advantages in different types of tasks and areas. Again, tying it back to a very deterministic way of understanding individuals' abilities. Why women are the care workers? Because they care, they care better. Why aren't they in STEM fields? Well, they're not good at math. It's pretty much boiling down to that. And then human capital theory is a little more sophisticated, but it really emphasizes the skills and the educational attainment of men and women, which could be determined or constructed by social factors, could be the result of individual choices too. And then there are all those other theories, not by economists, I have to say, or more introduced by feminist scholars or other social scientists, emphasizing the role of social norms in regarding the type of occupations more seen as more appropriate for different groups, or legal and institutional constraints limiting access of certain groups to certain occupations, or outright discrimination in hiring practices, in promotion at the workplace, in wage determination, and so on, especially relevant for the changes during the recession with unemployment in particular. One insight of economic theory, you'll laugh at it, but again, another theory introduced by Becker describes discrimination as a taste for employers. The idea is that some employers like discrimination. They would like to discriminate. Why? Well, we are not digging that far into why that happens, but some don't like women. Some don't like Black people. So they don't want to hire them, despite the fact that these people are equally qualified as those others that are not discriminated. So in order to indulge their taste for discrimination, these employers will be paying a premium in a sense. Rather than hiring the employee that is worthy of it at a relatively smaller cost, you are limiting your prospective employee pool to a much smaller one, which indirectly implies that you are paying a premium because you have fewer people to choose from, in a sense. And that taste, if you like, varies along the business cycle, depends on whether the economy is going through a recession or not. during expansionary times, when the economic growth is full force and companies are growing and so on, the employers we are looking at with a taste of discrimination might actually not find the opportunity to discriminate because they will be facing constraints coming from intensified competition and demand for labor by everyone else, so on and so forth. So discrimination really is effective during recessionary times, when unemployment is really high, because there's so many people out there that you, as that discriminatory employer, can indulge your taste and just not worry about paying the premium, because there are enough people out there willing to work at lower than ideal wages regardless during the recession. So I'm not going to go into details more, but even from that very economistic point of view, there are theories explaining the discriminatory factors at work, although economic discrimination theories typically put this concept into a matter of choice by the individual employers. Regardless, these theories will give us a set of variables that we can use to understand why certain individuals were unemployed during the pandemic. And a couple of things to note to distinguish COVID-19 induced recession from the previous ones. I have three important things. Again, these are also going to be considered in the empirical analysis. One thing is, unlike national recessionary periods experienced by the whole economy, pandemic-related closures of businesses and layoffs arrived in phases at different times in different regions of the country. It started first in the Northeast and the Northwest, and only later it arrived in South and Midwest and other sections. Why does it matter? Well, I will be looking at a national data set. So if a person is located in a region where the closures happened early and people were laid off a lot earlier than some other person located in the South, that could be a contributor factor for them being unemployed. Also, industries and occupations were affected not based on whether they have enough demand for their businesses, but based on government's classification of essential versus non-essential categories. So some businesses were allowed to operate, so they could stay open. In that case, employees at those businesses would keep their jobs. And the essential, non-essential classification changed a lot, and it still varies across different states. But federal government also has some guidelines as to what type of industries and occupations should be considered essential, so that they can continue operating under pandemic circumstances. I just gave you a link here from a government agency. Currently, some of the manufacturing industries, ranging from chemical to defense industrial base, a lot of government facilities, but also financial services, obviously healthcare, public health, transportation systems, all kinds of information technology industries, food and agriculture, communications. I mean, you can see that it's a pretty broad category, what is essential as far as industries go. But that was also different from previous recessions, because previous recessions typically implied that manufacturing would slow down a lot earlier than services, and a lot of services would not be really affected by the economic slowdown. Here, a lot of manufacturing industries stayed open, while some of the services like, hotel business, accommodations, restaurants, and the others within food industry had to shut down. So that's another way that this recession was different. Now, the essential, non-essential classification, of course, has implications for different group, racial and gender categories, as I was talking about how women and Blacks and Hispanics are overrepresented in certain industries. But this overrepresentation actually complicates things in this particular case. For instance, essential industries are those where people are more likely to keep their jobs. But then women make up the majority of essential workers in healthcare and government and community services. People of color make up the majority of essential workers in food and agriculture, more than 50%, actually 51%, and industrial, commercial, residential facilities and services businesses. So this actually really brings up kind of complicating question to our minds. How come women and people of color have lost their jobs disproportionately if they also are overrepresented in a lot of essential industries where people are less likely to lose their jobs? And same thing, different studies found women and people of color are overrepresented in workforce employed in frontline industries, which include grocery stores, public transit, healthcare again. So many different studies, I'm not citing here, but one can find that type of information in those studies. So why are they disproportionately unemployed if they are overrepresented in these industries? So that's really a question to answer. The last thing that COVID-19 recession brought to our attention as different from previous ones is the opportunity to work from home became a crucial determinant of whether a person keeps their job or not. Now, opportunity to work from home. In a lot of office type businesses, that opportunity existed. I mean, as we know well, for a short while in educational services, that obviously was not that hard. But when it comes to frontline industries like those grocery stores, public transit, healthcare, you can't really work from home. To the extent that those are essential industries, that's not a problem. But if the industry is not rendered essential and it's not easy to work from home, then you basically shut down, lay off your employees, which means job losses and higher unemployment. Now, we did some calculations based on occupations. That this particular topic was really hotly debated among scholars, the degree of teleworkability in the economy, and different measures were developed. And one measure quite popular, and we are using in this particular study too, showed that approximately 30 to 35% of jobs in the US economy can be work from home. So that's, of course, at the national economy level. When we look at particular industries to see what percentage of jobs in those industries can be work from home, the industries that came out as the most teleworkable industries are not surprising, really. Those are the second bullet point here: internet broadcasting and provisions, providers of internet, finance, insurance, and publishing industries have the highest degree of teleworkable jobs. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have food services and drinking places, restaurants and bars, basically, agriculture, hotel business, accommodation, personal and laundry services are industries with the least degree of teleworkable jobs. So being in one industry with lots of teleworkable jobs versus another type really must be an important determinant of whether people keep their jobs. So what do I do with all this? A little bit of complication, challenging questions to explain. We waited until June for April data from government to be released on unemployment. The data set we are using is from April 2020, current population survey. This is the main data set US Census Bureau and Bureau of BLS, Bureau of Labor surveys come together every month and conduct this survey with approximately 60,000 US households. They ask these people a bunch of questions, typically concerning labor market experiences of these people, ranging from industry, occupation, region, household income, wages in particular, how many hours they work, whether they're unemployed, what type of unemployment. Hundreds of questions are being asked. So that's what we are using. That's what the government uses to announce their monthly unemployment statistics. But we are using the raw microdata for that. We are using April 2020 because that was the peak of unemployment for the US economy. And we employed two different definitions of unemployed. The reason we use two different definitions, although I'll show you just results from one, is this misclassification issues. We define one narrow COVID-related unemployment, only marking those individuals who were laid off in the last 4 weeks of the survey, which was conducted in mid-April. We consider them COVID-related unemployed people. And at the national level, that added up to 10.5 million people. And then we defined a broader unemployment variable, upper bound, we called it, including the first group of people, plus those in temporary jobs whose contracts were not renewed. And then this ambiguous category of employed but absent while not laid off. And this is the misclassification that Fed chairman is still mentioning in those press releases, that is underestimating unemployment based on official statistics. People didn't know whether they should classify or consider themselves unemployed because they had not started searching for new employment. That's when you are considered unemployed, because they were in that in-between state where their businesses had shut down, but they never received that official laid-off notification. So they considered themselves, actually, those who conduct the survey considered them employed but absent. So if, for instance, those people are included, which adds up, makes the number of unemployed, instead of 10 million, 18 million, that peak of unemployment in April would be almost 20% rather than 14 or 15% of labor force. I'm going to skip this one so that I can talk about what type of variables we chose to explain individuals' unemployment. So we use 6 race gender categories for white men, white women, black men, black women, Hispanic men, and Hispanic women. When an individual fits into one of these categories, they were marked as one. We use 4 different educational categories coming from those human capital theories telling us that people with higher educational attainment would be paid higher wages, would be given preference when it's time for laying people off and so on. So in those 4 categories, we have individuals with less than high school or high school degree, associate degree, college degree, and further advanced degree. We included age to capture possible impact of seniority. There is no direct variable measuring seniority, asking people in this data set how many years they've been employed at their current place of employment. So we used age for that. And then we use this measure of teleworkability, if you like, for industries, which basically shows the percentage share of teleworkable jobs in an industry. And then you don't have to look at that, but we use 23 occupational categories because overrepresentation in certain categories is seen as the main reason for a lot of people of color and women to be unemployed at hard times like during recessions. So we use those to control for that explanatory factor. And then we use 14 industry categories ranging from agriculture to public administration, finance, education, health services, and so on. Finally, we use the binary variable, which takes the value of 0 and 1 for essential, non-essential distinction made for those industries. And to capture the phasing of those business closures, geographical phasing, we used a regional category for regions Northeast, Southwest, Midwest, and West of the United States, depending on where their businesses, their employment was located. And these are our control variables. Of course, we are interested in how the likelihood of unemployment differed across these race, gender categories, but we also want to make sure that those differences were not simply caused by the differences in these categories, these variables that are known to affect unemployment, especially during the pandemic. This is just an empirical methodology note. We used a regression analysis. It's a probit regression for those who are familiar. We are basically using our unemployment measure as a binary variable that takes the value of 1 or 0 if people are in that category of unemployed due to COVID. Variable takes the value of 1. And what this model does is that it estimates the probability of being unemployed for those individuals for different race, gender categories, while controlling for all other variables we mentioned. Okay, so these are the results, and I'm gonna walk you through the results. What I'm presenting here in this table, they're not the direct results of coefficients from probit regressions, but we calculated marginal probability effects, as they are called, which basically shows how white women, for instance, this asterisk here is, they're indicating the degree of statistical significance. So if you have 3 of them, that's the strongest statistical result, most significant statistical result that we have. And as you can see, most of them have that. So this particular one, for instance, is telling us white women, black men, black women, Hispanic men, Hispanic women. So all these categories, people in these categories were more likely to be unemployed compared to white men, while we are controlling for all the other things, meaning their higher likelihood of unemployment was caused by something other than these variables. So you see that in particular, women within the same race, within the same race ethnic category have higher unemployment likelihood compared to men. And people of color in general have higher unemployment likelihood compared to white people, which is not surprising. But we found that basically. And just to understand these figures, for instance, Hispanic women, this is how we read the results, were 5.3% more likely, and Black women were 4.4% more likely, while white women were only 2.8% more likely to be unemployed due to COVID. Compared to white men. So when we look at these categories, our reference category, the base category, is always white men and their experiences. And moving along, this is the main, these are the main variables of interest, but we also got the expected signs, at least, from the other variables like educational attainment. We saw that Those with college degrees and advanced degrees, negative sign, is telling us they were less likely to be unemployed compared to those with associate degrees, or which doesn't have a significant result, or less than high school and high school graduates. And essential industries, as you can see, those industries classified in essential, people in those industries were definitely less likely to be unemployed. Teleworkability also had the same result, but the differential probability is so minimal that it really made us think about whether this degree of teleworkability really mattered as much as the hype, at least in the academic circles, was made about it. So we wanted to see whether that degree of teleworkability meant anything for any particular group we are looking at. But it's important to note that whether the industry was deemed essential or not was more important than the degree of teleworkable jobs in industry when it came to people keeping their jobs. So to expand on this teleworkability business, we looked at some other analysis, since we expect that an industry with more teleworkable jobs should imply a lower probability of being unemployed for people in general. So did it work that way for any race, ethnicity, gender category, or all of them? That's what we are trying to answer. And the way it's done, I can go into more detail if anyone is interested, is that you basically recalculate those marginal effects, changes, and the impacts that we calculated, assuming a higher range of teleworkability, which is what we did. So here, what we see is even with high degree of teleworkable jobs in an industry, when we focus those type of industries, the unemployment probability for Black women and Hispanic women were still way higher than that of white men, 6% and 7%. And the higher likelihood of unemployment that white women and Black men had previously, on the previous slide I showed, it seemed to disappear in those types of industries. So if anything, there are certain groups that benefited from working in industries with highly teleworkable jobs. And those groups are, in addition to white men, white women and Black men, even to the extent that they were employed in those types of industries. But the differential probability, higher probability for Black women and Hispanic women did not change. And I'm not interpreting the one for Hispanic men because significance is very low in that case. So what have I found then? We control for all possible explanations, ranging from education, age, seniority. These are considered to be individual characteristics of labor force, labor supply. Different regions, different occupations, industries, essential, non-essential distinction, teleworkability. Having controlled for all of that, we find that women of color have been disproportionately affected by job losses induced by COVID-19. So if these differences cannot be explained by these factors that we control for, which are more observable factors, it must be about something unobservable, including discrimination. We are either missing some factor that was so important, or there is some truth to those arguments about discriminatory practices in hiring and firing of employees. So what might have happened? At this point, we are only speculating to interpret these results. It was found in earlier decades too. Due to discrimination, Blacks in general are typically last hired during the expansionary times for an economy, and they tend to be first fired. So in a sense, it has to do with the tenure, but it could also be the result of, in the first place, discriminatory practices. So perhaps something like that worked again for women of color. And discriminatory practices also leads to lower probability of on-the-job training for those employees, rendering those groups, those employees, more expendable during mass layoffs. If many people are being laid off, those with lower on-the-job training will be the first ones probably, because those are going to be considered to be the less useful ones for the company. And in particular, for this recession during the pandemic, you might know that the government loans were given to a lot of businesses, initially targeting small businesses, but turned out that a lot of large chains also benefited from it. And there are studies and survey results showing that minority businesses had serious difficulty in securing these loans made available by the government. Minority businesses employ more of those people of minority origin, which might be one reason why we find this kind of disproportional job losses for women of color. So there are other really important things to look into, though, to better understand such differences. One future direction that we want to take with this research has to do with whether women of color in particular are affected in a disproportionate manner by the childcare needs that emerge with the current pandemic situation. A lot of, actually the results of a July 2020 survey, government survey, showed that 1 in 5 adults stated the reason they were not working as the disruption in their childcare arrangements in general. And similar surveys also show that of those not working, women are 3 times as likely as men to not be working due to childcare demands. So these people who are not working are not officially unemployed. These people are considered to be out of the labor force. So when it comes to those surveys that the household survey that we use, they are not there at all. We simply have to exclude them because they're not employed, they're not unemployed either. They're simply not looking for jobs because they have to take care of their children. So we want to see if there was a higher proportion of women of color leaving the workforce because of these childcare related demands. After all, there is enough evidence, for instance, to recognize that among the single parent households, there is a higher proportion of Black women. Black mothers make up or are overrepresented in the single parent households, which again probably has consequences for this kind of exit from labor force. Why does it matter that we understand this? Leaving labor force really makes a big dent in people's professional career. It really reduces, studies shown that it reduces the likelihood of finding good jobs in the future, even after these people, typically women, decide to make a comeback to the labor force and get a job. So that gap has been really detrimental, and we think that this would have future consequences that way. I think that's pretty much it. And I think I did take a lot more time than I thought I would, but thanks for listening to me. So if there are questions, comments, I'm all ears. And I might not be able to follow all the comments in the chat, but I'm sure I'll get help.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Arman. That was really interesting and impressive in a couple of ways that I'd like to mention. I want to give other panelists or people out in the attendee audience a chance to ask questions first. So Yes, the panelists or students can speak. If you raise your hand, you can, but if you just unmute yourself, the camera will come on you or the emphasis will come on you, so feel free.
So I have a question
Hi.
in regards to the decrease in unemployment rate after what was the peak in April. This is a curious question. Do you think that for Blacks in particular, a reason why they may not have recovered as well as say Hispanics or white would have to do with the possibility of the George Floyd protests, maybe causing employers like not to want to hire them as quickly as other groups?
It's interesting. Well, this is actually, you're pointing at something that we did talk about checking, because you are suggesting re-entry, basically being rehired because unemployment rate obviously dropped at the national level. So that's true, but we didn't have a way of checking that because we only focused on the data from April 2020. So one thing you, I think, might be onto something, although I'm not sure if that's the only reason there. Let me just open this chart again. I'm assuming you can still see my website charts. Okay, so here it is. The unemployment rate for Blacks, Hispanics, whites all jumped in April, but later each one of them declined, of course. The decline in Hispanic unemployment is quite drastic, but not as much with Black unemployment. So obviously there is something as to being rehired that was so different between Blacks and other groups of non-white unemployed people. But I don't know. It might be other things. It might be simply the kind of discriminatory practices that I'm talking about. As I said, Blacks have been found in the past decades to be the last one hired during that rehiring periods there. Yeah, thanks for that.
Other questions?
I have one too. Thanks, Armand. This was really interesting. I got all excited when I saw the probability and the regression stuff. And I was thinking all along, so I'm really interested in your future direction of work, because I was wondering how childcare responsibilities would sort of be affecting exactly the variables you're looking at. So I think that's really interesting. And just off the top of my head, and I want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly. So if someone chooses to leave the labor force, then they're no longer counted in the labor force, right? If they choose not to be looking for jobs. So then when you're calculating unemployment, they wouldn't be counted in the total people either having or looking for employment. So in other words, it's changing your denominator. It's going to make the denominator of those percentages smaller, which would of course make the percentages go up, right? And so I think there's definitely something there, if I'm understanding that correctly.
Well, you're right. At the national level, when we hear that unemployment is currently at 6% officially, or 10% as the chairman suggested instead, in reality, that rate is exactly as you're describing, but those outside of labor force are not included in that denominator.
Right, right.
But the data we are using here is not using a ratio. We have microdata, as we call it, of individuals who are asked whether they worked or they have been unemployed or for what reasons and what type of arrangement. So anytime we find one person to be out of work in their way of thinking about it, within the last 4 weeks, as of mid-April, we put a check mark basically. So that variable takes the value of 1 for those and 0 for all others. So at the national level, you are right. But as far as the analysis here goes, there isn't a ratio we are using.
Okay. Yeah, great. Thanks. I look forward to hearing your future direction too.
Me too.
Miriam, I see you have your hand up. Please feel free to jump in. You'll need to unmute. There you go.
Hi, and I'm sorry I'm not visible, and I'm actually, it's kind of funny because I'm actually involved in my own childcare duties.
Of course.
I've been kind of coming in and out of your talk. I'm so sorry. So I apologize. My question is very big and might even have been something you addressed. I'm so sorry for that. But I was just wondering, I mean, I just think your work is so interesting, and I think it really points to something that's really been critical that's come out of this COVID-19 crisis. And I was wondering, if you've been thinking of ways that you could use your data and your research to kind of start to implement some changes, particularly where women are concerned and women in childcare, because I think, what I was, from my own experience, it seems that this health crisis has really kind of put the spotlight on the ways in which like our society just barely works because and women are doing a lot of kind of stretching in order to make it work, and then the pandemic happened and everything exploded. So do you have a sense of where we could go with this research and with this data and with these results to kind of start making a difference so as to make it possible for women to not be in this kind of position, next time this comes around? I don't know if I'm making sense. I'm sorry. I'm like,
no, I think thanks a lot for all the kind words and for the question too. I think you are onto something, Miriam, because it was the President Biden who spoke about these issues, that particular disproportionate effect on women in terms of leaving labor force specifically, and how it is not acceptable. I don't know what they have in mind, current administration, but they're in tune with the current present state of research. And as far as our research goes, once we published it, we were cited by a couple of working papers coming out of NBER, National Bureau of Economic Research, which tends to produce the kind of economic research that administrations generally take into consideration. So for now, I think that's what I will think about, that somebody actually is reading it out there, and perhaps those are the people who are making the recommendations to the administration. But what particular forms that can take, I mean, I can even imagine that support being a part of the current stimulus package. But if you're thinking long run, I'm all for socialization of childcare. I think it's one of those things any advanced country should seriously think about, and it would both liberate women from their traditional roles, but also would open up the possibilities in terms of bringing a big chunk of the potential labor into labor force that is out. And this is not only for women, of course, whoever is holding back, being held back due to childcare demands or simply the unaffordability of it. I mean, this is an incredible problem causing what we call working poor, especially among women of color. People work 2 jobs, and at the end of the day, what they make a month is $1,500. There's no way that they can afford childcare with that $1,500, $2,000. So it basically comes down to not being able to work, withdrawing from labor force. So I don't have proposals, but definitely in the short run, whatever the stimulus package is going to include, our political scientists can tell us more probably about it. The childcare support could be a part of it.
Thank you so much, Arman, and congratulations. It sounds like your studies
Thank you.
is doing all the right things.
And
Thank
I'm
you.
afraid I can't answer the childcare stimulus question. There's an attendee named Benjamin, I believe. Yes.
Yes, hello. Thank you for your presentation. I have a quick question. So you mentioned that, I mean, you pointed out the difference between the larger impact on women over men, and then specifically white women over white men, and then also specifically you pointed out the larger impact on Black women over Black men. I was wondering what like the difference between those differences would be. Are men and Black women impacted more similarly than Black men and women versus white men and women? Do you know what I'm asking?
Yeah, I think you're saying within racial categories between men and women, why are there those differences? Because,
Yeah.
right? Did I get that right?
Yeah, and is it smaller between Black men and women than it is with white men and women?
Well, one nice thing about putting the results into this marginal probability effects is that these probabilities can be directly compared. So while in this original, the initial table I showed, while Black women are 4.4% more likely than white men, Black men is 3.4% more likely. So these are not absolute values, but the likelihood of being unemployed. So obviously, as you pointed out, Black men's likelihood of being unemployed compared to white men, of course, but is still lower than that of Black women. So for the category of African Americans in particular, the first thing, and probably for Hispanics too, the first thing that comes to my mind is which industries they are overrepresented. Really, perhaps the largest share of African American women are in care and in care section of healthcare. It's in-home care or residential care. A lot of African American women work in those areas. As far as residential care goes, I don't think they lost their jobs, but any kind of in-home care ended together with pandemic. When we look at the Black men, we find them in transportation, but not airline transportation. It's ground transportation, warehousing, storage, logistics. These things were deemed to be a part of critical infrastructure, and they tended to stay open because they were considered to be essential. So I think that might be one difference. A similar thing for Hispanic men and women. Hispanic women are, a lot of the time, they are in hotel businesses. They are the housekeepers and others. And Hispanic men are either in agriculture, which again was deemed essential, or in what we call support occupations, where they are the guards for offices and administrative support of that sort, that are not exactly an occupation inside an office, but auxiliary support. So I think it is to that extent between men and women within one racial category, it is more about these differences. But at the same time, intersectionality, if teaches us anything, when it comes to discriminatory practices, we know that in the social hierarchy of labor market, in the minds of employers, Black women are always placed at the very bottom, which is interesting because that's not the case at all, especially in the last couple of decades for white women compared to white men. The image of the image of a Black woman in the discriminatory mind, or as I said, the employer with a taste for discrimination, as they call it, is going to be discriminating against Black women a lot more than Black men, which is interesting. I don't really have too much to say about why that is the case.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Are there other questions?
Yeah, actually, I just had a quick question. Is there any aggregate data that's specifically available for the indigenous community in North America, which was particularly hard hit by COVID? So I was just wondering if that data was available, if that could be disaggregated from some of the other data.
Within this data set, it exists. The reason we didn't include is because we are using so many categories, which means that we are looking at, say, different regions of the nation, different industries and occupation. We didn't treat Native Americans as a separate category in the same way Asians we didn't treat, because within each industry, occupation, region, there isn't enough data, enough observation to infer. It's not representative. But as you rightly asked the question, at the aggregate level, this survey results at the national level in aggregate stats, and that can be found on the website of Bureau of Labor Statistics.
Thanks.
But I haven't really checked. And we started with one more category of Asian men and women, but we decided to drop it later because of that number of observation problem. It was really interesting because Asian women and men have completely different experiences than Black women, men, Black Hispanic men and women. They didn't lose their jobs as much. It's not that different from white women and white men, we found, but we didn't want to conclude anything.
Wes, Martin, you have a question.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Armand. That's a really wonderful presentation. And as always, you're clear and really compelling with the work you present to us. Sarah and I have been listening at home with real delight. So she's upstairs and down here, watching carefully. So unfortunately, I'm going to phrase my question badly because I think I'm thinking about it badly, but maybe we'll be able to figure this out. I'm interested in reentry and the costs of delayed reentry to the labor force. And so when you expanded the graph so that we could see the detail within the most recent recession since last spring, there was a rapid change, what appeared to be a rapid reduction in unemployment among the three groups that you were plotting. And I'm interested in the possibility of quantifying the opportunity cost economically of failing to reintroduce the people who've lost their jobs, because last hired, first fired means that there's going to be a protracted period of time in which the women who are white, the women of color, and the people of color more generally fail to get reintroduced to the job market, fail to produce goods and services. And can't we look at the cost of failing to rehire them in relation to the cost of subsidizing their rehiring? Bad question.
Well, I think it's a really good question. There is an opportunity cost for the individuals themselves, but I think you are also implying a cost to the economy, or right?
Yes, yes. Because then that provides the wherewithal for the people at the NBER to make the case to the Biden administration and to both parties in Congress.
Right. Well, that's a really good point. And I think I'm just thinking as the scholar, it should be possible. I haven't seen any studies because I think that would require a more comprehensive model of the economy where demand side factors need to be modeled also, because if we are going to think opportunity cost for the economy at large, it needs to be aggregated. And it's not that clear where we could have been in terms of our pattern over the business cycle if they were to be rehired. So not rehiring people uniformly across different groups is more about not seeing the business itself coming back rather than anything at this moment. If it is uniform like that across different groups, you just don't need employees yet because you haven't opened yet. So in that case, whether there is an opportunity cost is a first of all question to think about for the economy. If there isn't demand for production, would there be a reason to employ these people and produce things? There is, but beyond that, of course, if that kind of rehiring, I'm talking hypothetically, weren't uniform. No, we know that it's not uniform. So some people are not hired, and that cost is always there. I think for the kind of thinking you are implying at the individual employer level is what had been calculated for previous recessions as that premium the employer pays for discrimination. The employer with a taste for discrimination pays a premium, which typically occurs in that the additional wage, in a sense, that they have to pay for the good guys that they want to hire in their mind. So perhaps that would be a basis for it, but I'm not sure at the economy level how to quantify that.
Is the Japanese experience with a lost decade of growth 2 decades ago a potential parallel that could push this kind of inquiry along?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned it, because it actually is tying it to something relevant that I avoided using. All these discussions about potential output versus actual output, that where the US economy could be, should be, potentially has to do with, given the resources and the existing demand, what we could have done, but we are not doing, how big of a gap we have. So the experience of Japanese economy lagging way behind potential output, their potential basically, can be tied. And I actually saw papers tying that 2 lost decades, and still actually not in recovery, not because of the pandemic, but it wasn't in recovery even before, to the way that Japanese economy utilizes women. That was, women in that social hierarchy are quite discriminated against in the Japanese labor force. So I can see how one can make connections, but I haven't done any kind of serious thinking along those lines, really. Thank you
very much.
So one of the, I've always mentioned as host of this that I get to ask the last question. That's a privilege, that I can, since I get to determine time. And so I do have a sort of a big question, just sort of backs up on everything. This is a really complicated, reliable set of data that was developed fairly quickly, as far as I can tell. One of the things that really shakes me is how fresh this information is and how current, the thing that you're analyzing is. And you're subjecting it to the kind of rigorous analysis that I guess I would have figured we'd see 5 years or 10 years down the road. And here we are in the middle of it, and you're looking at it this way. That's really impressive. And I'm wondering, are economic conventions, are the journals, are they starting to fill with current analysis of COVID, or is this something that you guys are out ahead on? It feels like you might be.
Well, there were a lot of call for papers from different journals about the special issue regarding the economic impact of COVID, or depending on the journal specialty. But a lot of them have still deadlines ahead of us, let alone having an issue out, because you know how academic publishing works. You send it to a journal, it takes 1.5 years at least for the peer review to be completed. I think we got lucky with the journal that we sent it to. It was a strategic choice, but I have to also mention that we worked so hard this summer to be able to make it to that deadline, because my colleague and I, we don't have childcare duties. I think that really changed the life for a lot of academics this summer, that they weren't productive at all because, they have children and I don't.
It's really interesting and really ironic. But yeah, and I think you're seeing the payoff of it. I think it looks like policymakers might be reading this article and drawing inferences that might lead to practice.
Yeah.
So with that, I think I will wrap it up. And thank you, Armagan, very much for a very interesting talk.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank all the people that came this week, and let you know that Miriam, who I believe is still out in the audience, will be the presenter next week. Really looking forward to that. And until then, good night, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much, everyone.